Malthouse. I am the research director of the Spiegel Research Center at Medill, which is in Northwestern University. Our mission is to study how various forms of new customer engagement affect financial outcomes of a firm. Today we're going to talk about specific types of customer engagements in the B2B space. So it's my great pleasure to have with us Jonathan Copulsky, who is the former CMO of Deloitte Consulting. And Jonathan is going to talk to us about how the Spiegel Research Center worked with Deloitte on understanding how B2B content marketing affected financial outcomes. Jonathan, there's been a lot of work done over the years on understanding B2B content. My question for you is, what's new? So what was new in the work that came out of the work with Spiegel Research Center?
Well, thanks, Ed, and glad to be with you today. So we've been at Deloitte, and I've recently retired, as you know, from Deloitte. We have focused on content marketing as one of the core pillars of our go-to-market strategy. And historically, we've looked at what we've called the 3 R's. How do we build better relationships? How do we build our reputation? And how do we drive revenues? And what we really want to learn in partnership with Spiegel was to focus on the third thing, because we have a pretty good idea about activities and relationships, but not so much a clear idea about how to attribute revenues to content marketing activities.
So I know that part of the work involved developing a customer engagement index. Could you talk a little more about what that customer engagement index did and how it contributed to your 3 R's?
Sure. You know, as I said, historically, we had a pretty good idea about relationships and reputation and the role of content marketing contributing to that. But the missing R, which was the revenue. And working with you and the team really focused on, could we come up with some way to measure how much clients engage with us and then tie that to specific outcomes? And the outcomes would be they created more opportunities for us, or we did a better job of winning the opportunities that were presented to us, or ultimately that we grew our revenues with them. And working with you and your team, we looked at this thing called an engagement index, a client or customer engagement index, as a surrogate for figuring out how much do they engage with us and how does that relate to the factors that drive revenue growth. So
then when clients engage, that's kind of an early warning that they could be open for more business.
Well, it's an interesting question because this engagement index I see as having a couple of potential applications. One, which is an indicator of potential interest. So if they start reading all kinds of articles about the Internet of Things, we better be there and talk to them about the Internet of Things as a follow-up. Alternatively, if we see some waning interest in engaging with us, perhaps that's a yellow flag that we're not paying as much attention to the client as we should, and so therefore we should increase the attention that we pay to that client, because that could be an early indicator as opposed to a lagging indicator of potential downturn in revenues.
So Jonathan, you mentioned the 3 R's, but it sounds like there's a 4th R, which is relevance.
Well, in theory, as we build these relationships, right, as we build this reputation and so forth, yes, it's absolutely incumbent upon any kind of provider to make sure that the content is incredibly relevant to the target audience. And that goes to your question about the balance between being broad and being very narrow. So identifying what's relevant and then being able to deliver that to the appropriate target audience is critical to the success, certainly in a B2B context of a content marketing strategy.
So Jonathan, you mentioned that there were some counterintuitive findings that came out of the study. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. One of the things that surprised me personally was the power of some of the digital marketing activities relative to the in-person events that we ran. And as you can imagine, digital is relatively cheap. We create it and then we can execute multiple times, whereas in-person events really require quite a bit of logistics and coordination. So understanding that many of the in-person events really had mixed track record in producing outcomes was incredibly surprising to me, but also gave us an opportunity to take some action in terms of reducing the cost and refocusing some of our energies around digital.
So a lot of companies have embraced the Net Promoter Score over the past decade or so. How is this engagement index different than NPS?
Yeah. So NPS is a good tool, but it's also a limited tool because typically what you do when you do Net Promoter Scores, you go out to customers and ask them, how they feel about you. And you try to come up with the ones who are big supporters versus the ones who are detractors, and then you net those out to get a promoter score. The problem with Net Promoter Score is what people say rather than what they do, right? And so it is limited because sometimes people say what they would do, which is not consistent with what they actually do. So the thing with the client engagement index is we're looking at behavior. The behavior is how they engage with activity. So we're not asking them how they feel about Deloitte or somebody else, but they're asking them, when in fact we're not asking, we're measuring their actions based upon their consumption of different marketing activities. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but together the two can be very valuable tools because Net Promoter Score being more of indicators of people's preferences, but the engagement index actually describing behavior and relating that behavior to outcomes.
But it seems to me also that this engagement index is something that you monitor at the client level, whereas Net Promoter Score is you have a sample of customers and you have an overall rating, but you don't know what any individual client really thinks.
Yeah, I do think some companies do use NPS at an individual client level. And B2B, some people have tried to implement Net Promoter Score. We're really looking at large accounts and they're surveying a number of people. As I said, this is, as we know from any kind of research, there is a moral hazard sometimes in asking people, say, what they might do or how they feel, depending upon the circumstances and context in which you ask them. So I don't think it's necessarily either or, but it does give a valuable complement to what people may already be doing with Net Promoter Scores.
If we step back and think about this in the overall context of a B2B strategy, where does this engagement work fit?
So Deloitte, and I can speak for Deloitte, but I know from working with clients, in business to business, for many companies, that 80-20 kind of Pareto distribution is very applicable to the business, meaning some small percentage of clients account for a disproportionate share of total revenues. Mm-hmm. And for Deloitte, those are the crown jewel clients, the portfolio clients, and so forth. And so this is a way to help to facilitate successful execution against those portfolio clients. So it really is, gives the LCSP tool, it gives the LCSP a tool that he or she can use to really get better about how they approach that relationship management for the most valuable clients. So you wouldn't necessarily think about this for the clients who don't represent the 80% of the revenues, but really, how do I take those relationships which are so valuable to my enterprise success and really get better and better at monitoring, managing, and growing those kinds of relationships. So at the end of the day, for an organization like Deloitte, it's still very much about the client service team, the management, the face-to-face relationships. So this is not a substitute for it. It's a way to augment that with some data-driven analytical tools that help to indicate where the relationship may be going, and relationships that you think might be healthy maybe are less healthy than you think, or potentially a relationship which is still in early stages and growing, may be growing faster than you realize, and so it's an opportunity to reallocate your efforts as a client service team.
How does this change the relationship between the Salesforce and marketing?
So I think, once again, in B2B, a lot of organizations, Deloitte included, ultimately looks to its face-to-face resources as the way to manage relationships, and then complements that through digital channels and others. But I think this is a way to help those LCSPs, the client relationship team, which is headed by that lead client service partner, do a better job of understanding what it needs to bring to the client to advance that relationship. And I've heard many times in talking with clients that Deloitte, you guys do a great job, you're wonderful, you're fantastic, and so forth. But I want you to bring me new ideas. Help me to think about things I haven't thought about before. So this helps an LCSP to understand whether he or she is doing an effective job of bringing new ideas to that client, which is part and parcel of maintaining and sustaining that relationship over time. So once again, it's a tool. It's a tool. It's a way to help that LCSP to be more laser-like focused on the stuff that matters, and looking at marketing as a resource to help him or her to do that.
How will B2B marketing change in the future?
So it's funny, for a different purpose, I've been interviewing a number of senior executives in B2B marketing positions. And I've asked them exactly that question. And what they have said to me, which is consistent with the experience that I've had as a B2B marketer, is the customer decision journey, the process that customers go through to determine what suppliers to use, is getting more and more complicated. It's getting much more digital. It's getting much more content oriented, so that when customers come to you, they're much smarter, they're much better equipped, they have a vision, correct or not, of what your brand stands for, they know about your capabilities. Not unlike on the B2C side, where people have gotten more and more empowered. So that notion of that empowered, educated, smarter customer is spilling over from B2C to B2B, and even in very, very complex purchases, things which are way more complicated than professional services. They may be literally, for rocket scientists, people are saying that that journey's gotten more complicated and become more digital first.
So I want to thank you for everything. So it's been incredible working with the Deloitte team. So thank you, Jonathan.
Oh, you're welcome, and appreciate all the help that Spiegel and you and the team have provided.